The Prime Minister's back in the country after a less than smooth overseas trip to Rome for the G20, then Glasgow for the climate talks. Let's talk to Mark Kenny. He's professor at the ANU's Australian Studies Institute. It really was a rocky trip, no doubt about it. How does it play, though, in Australia, do you think, the reception and the reaction from the French particularly?
It's a bit early to tell. There's always a danger in sort of making contemporaneous analyses of how important something is in a historical sense. We don't really know how this is going to be looked on by voters down the track. Will it affect their view of the government? Now, I think you can safely say, and a number of people have made this point, I've certainly made it myself before, foreign affairs questions don't usually determine elections, right? So I don't think voters are going to be sort of all that animated about arcane debates in foreign affairs and strategic policy and so forth. I mean, the big questions like China, of course, you know, they permeate through, but I think this sort of spat in and of itself, in its details, perhaps, you know, most people aren't going to be that animated by it and in fact might agree with Scott Morrison's recent entreaty to just move on. That said, I do think it plays into that narrative that Labor's been building around Scott Morrison of being fast and loose with the truth, of always finding an excuse, of trying to blame other people, of arguing black is white, of lying, as the way Labor puts it, you know, these kinds of things. So I think there's a danger for Morrison in all of this, and in that sense it was a bad trip. But go back to the original reason for the trip, right? I mean, you had the G20 at the start, but the original reason for the trip, you know, was Morrison going to be in Glasgow? Was he going to have a net 50 target? He went to Glasgow in the end. I mean, there was a lot of umming and ahhing about it, but he decided to go in the end. And of course, he had his net zero. There's not a lot of detail behind it, but his agenda was only ever really to neutralise this issue.
Yeah, and I know that the lack of details cop flack and so on, but he has been able to land. And as you and I know, we've watched it for years, the ups and downs, more downs than ups of the climate debate. This Prime Minister has landed a climate emissions reduction deal with Barnaby Joyce. I mean, I don't think people should lose sight of that, should they? Well,
I suppose not, although I think one of the things that I've probably made this comment to you before, but one of the things that I think I've learned since sort of stepping out full-time from the gallery and going into this other role is you sort of get a slightly bigger perspective and you tend to see things less from the politician's point of view. I think it's true to say that's a really tough thing to get a deal on climate through the coalition party room, to get the Nats to agree to it. I think you're right to say that. But do voters actually care about how hard it is for the individual politician? Do they care about the kind of work, you know, the innards of the sausage, or do they care about the sausage itself? You know, they don't want to see it being made.
No.
They're not particularly interested in hearing about that. It tends to make it less enjoyable to eat.
Yeah.
I say that as the host of a podcast called Democracy Sausage.
Yeah,
so
just bring some onion, that's all. Yeah, so I guess it's a very good point that you make, though, in terms of don't rush to judgment as to whether or not it's a negative or not. I thought the French ambassador overplayed his hand yesterday, to be honest, watching that speech. It was an extraordinary address. He did throw in, you know, tick the box. We obviously have a great respect for Australia's contribution. I personally think it required a little more than ticking the box when you look at what that contribution was historically. I'm not defending the Prime Minister saying, you know, he's offended Australia and all that sort of stuff, but just watching that, I found it a little bit uncomfortable to watch with the French ambassador to Australia. It's not the Chinese ambassador, it's the French ambassador. We know the history. Maybe he should have, would have done him and his nation justice to reflect on that history a bit more, in my opinion.
It's a reasonable point to make, and I think you know, there's no doubt they went in pretty hard, and to a lot of people's ears that will have been, you know, sort of straying into tantrum territory. You know, look like a slight overreaction, or yes, okay, your feelings are hurt, but at what point?
And this would, I think, include a lot of people who thought, you know, the government might have been unfair. They should have been more upfront. But then when someone overreacts, you know, in, as you say, a tantrum sort of way.
Well, I think it tended towards it. I'm not making that point myself, but I think some people have made that point. Yeah, and I think that's why Morrison says time to move on. And why Barnaby Joyce says, you know, they should get over it and so forth. I think there is a sentiment out there like that. And I noticed that the government's very strongly sort of arguing that this was this was the AUKUS arrangement that they've gone into is a much bigger sort of security arrangement with many layers. What the French ambassador was trying to say yesterday was that there were many more layers to the arrangement for the supply of these submarines as well. So, I think there's probably exaggeration on both sides, but there's no doubt the government handled this badly, and I don't fully understand why the PM didn't come out and say, we had a sovereign right to do this and we acted in our sovereign interest. Yeah. However, yes, with hindsight, it would have been nice to do it a slightly different way.
Mark Kenny, thanks.